Okay, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to this virtual symposium on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the title of this symposium is The Changing U.S. Landscape for DEI, Global Implications and Responses. I am Matteo Winkler. I am an associate professor here at HEC Paris. And first of all, I want to thank so much our speakers and panelists who applied for this symposium to share their ideas on the global shift in DEI, which followed the new administration in the United States. The other very important thing is that I want to thank so much Adrienne Penturier, who is one of members of our amazing pedagogy team. So thank you so much, Adrienne, for helping us out with this seminar. The seminar will be recorded because we plan to post it on YouTube and other social media to share our ideas with the world. And I personally will be posting it on LinkedIn many times. There will be a second session next week at the same time, which is July 1st at 5 p.m. CET. So without further ado, I propose we follow up with a short introduction by me and my partner in crime, Marcella Liberté. Marcel?
Hi, everyone. Apologies for the echo.
Yeah, sorry, it's me.
Here we go.
Okay.
So we just wanted to take a bit of time to outline a bit of what we're going to cover today and next week during these sessions. And the aim for this session was to be able to gather both researchers and practitioners to be able to give different perspectives as to what's going on in terms of the changing landscape around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we have speakers that are coming in from North America, Europe, and research that's been done globally, both through, like I said, through the paradigms of researchers, different disciplines, and from practitioners in the field, which we hope to give sort of different perspectives. And in the slides, you'll see Matteo will showcase the different speakers that we have lined up for today and tomorrow, with the different topics that are going to be covered. And we invite questions. So every speaker gets about 10 to 12 minutes to present their work. And from there, we invite questions both from our other speakers in the audience and attendees that are also joining us. So don't hesitate to use the chat function. I will try to capture some of the questions to be able to share out at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, let us begin with our first speaker, who's gladly been volunteered, our colleague Alessandro Ghio, who's at ESCP Business School here in France.
Fantastic. So first of all, thank you very much, Marcel and Matteo, for creating this space. It's great that you put your faith and your effort in creating this for all of us. So much appreciated. So sharing now my screen with you. So hello everyone, I'm Alessandro. I'm an associate professor of performance measurement at the ESCP Business School. So I am a professor of business, and today my take will be mostly around work. And so the question that I really much raise is, are we at the end on the workplace of diversity and equity? Why do I say this? Well, companies that said for a long time that diversity were in their DNA are scrapping their activities, but not only their activities of the diversity, equity, inclusion, but also their reporting. So from annual reports, here we have an article from Financial Times. We see American Express, MasterCard, Salesforce, among the companies that in 2024 some of them had even a standalone diversity, equity, inclusion report. Now they don't even mention in the annual report. Then what is happening is that one of the major accreditation body, the ASSB for business schools and university, removed the term diversity and equity from its standards. So of course they said it's just a change of labeling, which is also what most companies are doing, but moving towards community, but this is another signal. And the third thing I want to highlight in terms of the environment, so we said workplaces, business school, and even academic associations, since most of us are in the academic world. So this is my academic association, which is the American Accounting Association, and in particular, the diversity section, the only one that I always attend. So diversity section has been there for 30 years, early on more focusing on gender, recently more race and ethnicity, of course, open to all. What happened? Well, we just went through a change of name after the pressure from many, because some colleagues couldn't attend anymore the meetings, and changed the name of the section in engagement, access, and community section. So we've seen very much a shift. So in 6 months after the January 12th executive order, an institutional change that really much shuffled the world we were. But where we were before in the business world? Well, for a long time, probably we had some seeds already, also problems actually in diversity. So this is the very famous 2015 diversity McKinsey report that some of you that know that I don't particularly appreciate, but the idea is that diversity is a business case. So that more diversity led to better financial performance. No, you have more. The idea was you have more women on board of directors, you will increase your return on investment. So, but what happens now that actually there is not any more business case because they cut your contracts. So diversity is not anymore worth it. The second element I want to highlight, that it was a bit problematic and now emerge even stronger, is that we also often had this horse race between merit and diversity. So that it seems that the two elements were in conflict on the workplace, and so if you promote diversity, this will come to the detriment of merit. But never questioning what is merit. What is merit? You are in a big four, you wanna move forward. If you bring a new client, which is your cousin or your brother-in-law, is this merit or not? And the third element, which was quite important from a performance perspective, is very often that this idea of, as we said, companies were reporting about diversity, but very often these targets and this reporting were empty signifiers, saying, okay, we need to have 20% of women, 20% of BIPOC people, 20% of LGBT people, let's say, but no actions. Or looking at gender from a binary perspective, so omitting, for instance, non-binary people. Or even ranking people in the sense that, and ranking diversities in the sense that, well, we privilege some potential activities in the workplace and some diversity to the detriment of others. So we see very much a tension between the new institutional changes, the one that I highlighted at the beginning of this presentation, so in terms of the executive order of Trump, of the companies walking back, of business schools being a bit on the fence. And on the other hand, we had some tensions that were already there, especially from diversity being a business case, or having some problematic approach to diversity. So how do we solve this? Well, it's hard to say solve it. In this second and last part of my presentation, what I want to highlight are potential way forward, which are a bit of a provocations. So my first point, and what I encourage in this period, is to be woke. But woke going very much to the roots of the meaning. So as roots, like woke means awakeness of consciousness, no? And so trying to reappropriate this word that has been used to almost point the fingers towards like a leftist Marxist ideal type of value, rather than pointing to the idea that we should all thinking what's the role of diversity in our context. So as much as queer has been reappropriated by the queer community in terms of thinking of alternative to the norms, well, we should reappropriate the work principle, and maybe it could be a term we all work around together. But how we do this? So three main points. So first, taking a political stand around diversity. So diversity has been criticized for being managerialistic, for being too wishy-washy. Why do we have diversity? We have diversity to fight against discrimination. So that's the fundamental. We have diversity because there are power imbalances on the workplace, and so we need to fight against discrimination. So maybe, again, bringing to the fore the idea of fight against discrimination. Second point, make everyone feeling responsible, not only certain groups. But what does it mean? It means also that diversity can be a cost, but the cost for companies, financial and human. But as much as we value feminism, so we pay for parental leave even if we don't have kids, or we value retirement even if we are still working and we contribute, maybe everyone needs to chip in some way to contribute. And so it cannot always be a win-win, but it can be a cost, and it's fine. And the very last point is to value effort. So very often, as these activities are considered, diverse activities are considered like something that we do because it's close to our heart, or because on the workplace we feel that we should voice. But this comes with fatigue, with stress, and so with a burden on some activities. And so we should, and workplaces should value efforts. So to conclude, so what the main point, so yes, we are in a period of institutional change. Yes, there have been problems in the past. It is a moment where workplaces could rethink some activities and become woke. Well, that is what I hope, and also what I hope that the discussion can contribute to move forward these reflections. So, of course, I thank you, merci, grazie, and if you have any questions beyond this panel, feel free to reach out to my ESCP email address, which is on the screen. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. That was really amazing. So if let's see if there are questions from the chat. Otherwise, I will have a question for you. Also, the other panelists, feel free to ask questions. I will break the ice if you allow me to do so. So I like very much the idea of linking DEI to the fight against discrimination. I see, however, a sort of shift on narrative really in the discrimination part, because now the main positioning of the Trump administration is that DEI policies, DEI corporate programs, they are discriminatory. So before, that was a kind of introduction that I thought it could fit well in this event. So it's like, before we said we do DEI because otherwise we would discriminate. And now we said, they tell us you should not do DEI because otherwise you would discriminate. So it's exactly the opposite. And this narrative U-turn is due, of course, to a couple of judgments of the Supreme Court, especially the one of Harvard college admissions. Maybe, you know, the lawyers in the panel will come back to that. So I want to ask you, how do you reconcile this idea of your recommendation to fight against discrimination with the idea that there's exactly where the problem lies?
Definitely. If you allow me, I just pull out one slide so that can help to. So just briefly, I would agree that if we would all be on the same starting point, definitely some what we call positive discrimination or actions around diversity would be discriminatory. But the fundamental idea is that this society is not neutral. We have an idea that there are power imbalances. Okay, so discrimination, and so who is closer to the what in the center of the slides is power. Well, definitely has some advantages, and so the idea is very much to level the playing field, and so this very much, if you are at the core, so if you are in the global north, white, Caucasian, Anglo-Saxon, native settlers, you have a starting point which is completely different if you are, for instance, lesbian, black, migrant, and so this we cannot assume that the society is neutral. And so we have always this idea that measure, even reporting is objective and neutral. Nothing is objective and neutral. Everything is a social construction. And so that's why, in my opinion, the fight against discrimination comes very much from this idea of understanding and trying to rebalance a bit the power shifts. But in my opinion, are even they are fighting against the wrong 1%.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. Then I would give the floor to Joanne together with Ellie. And please, Joanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And let me see if I can succeed in sharing my screen. Here we go. Is that everybody see? Okay, terrific. Well, thank you also, Matteo, Marcel, for putting this together. Very happy to be a part of this. Ellie has permitted me, in the interest of time, to sort of pull this presentation together, and then she will field all your hard questions. So I thought that was a completely fair division of labor. But Ellie, also please feel free to step in. Ellie is not only, as it says here, the research director at the Institute of Business Ethics in the UK, but she was also formerly, and this is how we met, the head of the gender benchmark at the World Benchmarking Alliance. So let me just proceed. I'm going to start with kind of what we're actually, let me just go back to the title of our talk, What's the Matter with DEI, a Reset. And this is actually a work in progress. It is going to be the sequel to a report that I'm about to introduce, and it is you'll hear about it in a second. But again, very, very grateful to get your feedback at this. It's a perfect timing for us at this early stage. So the background is that in 2022. And the we here, and that's the little logo there, is an organization I co-founded in 2018, Rights Collab, which is the group that I'm sort of doing this project as part of. We do a lot of work with investors, and in particular, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which had made a decision to prioritize DEI because it is sort of absolutely financially material. There's incredible investor interest. This was a priority standard setting project, and it continues to be. The SASB has now integrated into something called the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is part of the reason that we're doing this work. And we sort of scratched our heads and said, okay, but what do investors think DEI is? And so in a way, we were trying to do a kind of descriptive report on looking at 429 metrics that sit across 21 influential frameworks to understand how DEI was being defined by the metric that the market uses. And this is a sense of what we mean by the frameworks. In 2022, we had 21 frameworks. In our next report, which we'll be talking about, we now have expanded that to 36 frameworks. So these span guidance, disclosure, benchmarks, investment management tools, and the like. And what we saw, and this is actually a word cloud from a presentation we did the year after, so there were 2 more frameworks and a bunch more metrics. But what we found is that there really was little consensus on the concrete meaning of DEI, that market actors diverged on the scope and emphasis of their DEI initiatives, and that as a consequence, companies had to cope with a patchwork of measurement tools. So the range of ways in which DEI was being deployed, or you can still say is being deployed, gives rise to several questions, such as how does the market understand what equity distinctively adds to the concepts of diversity and inclusion? How is that concept represented in the metrics that guide both investors and investees around what to measure and manage? How does it link up with those concepts to human rights and to the employer, government, and labor-supported ILO core conventions? Are prevailing conceptions of DEI sufficient to reverse private sector contributions to inequality, and so forth? So this report was intended as a step in the process of building a wider consensus. And what we saw, and again, this is like the year later with a few more metrics in it, is that there was a very heavy emphasis here on what we will call representation metrics. So that's represented by the recruitment, retention, and promotion rates and the management and ownership board demographics. And we noticed it at the time. We took note in the report. We did in internal conversations say, but shouldn't there actually be, equity and fairness for all? And how do we understand that? But again, this was simply a snapshot or picture of where we were at the time. But again, here we are today. And so some of you may have seen this Forbes piece where they actually did the work for us in putting together a unfortunately long list of all the companies that are rolling back their DEI metrics and DEI programs. So this gives rise to our new research question, which is how can a company operating in the U.S. and Europe successfully navigate the current polarized U.S. environment in a way that resonates with its diverse consumers, employees, investors, and other stakeholders to creates more resilient and inclusive workplaces and avoids running afoul of the DEI backlash. And so that gives rise to our title, What's the Matter with DEI, which is meant to be a double entendre of both meanings. So what's so bad about DEI and what's wrong with DEI? And so this time we're taking a normative approach and we're sort of building on those 2022 insights to propose a set of metrics that we're selecting from this updated list. We now have 700 DEI metrics, as I mentioned, across 36 frameworks. And so we're trying to define a path forward. Matteo, to your point here is the language of that executive order where the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is falsely claimed and as being how Trump chose to manipulate it, but he does lean in directly in the EO on the Civil Rights Act and specifically Title VII that prohibits employment discrimination based on race, religion, sex, and national origin. And it's also the act that gave rise to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that was intended to enforce the provisions of the act. But it seems that there really is a kind of DEI confusion. So in a May 9th New York Times article reporting on Trump's plan to halt the disparate impact liability rule used to assess discrimination against different groups, It refers to DEI as, then the journalist does this, as a catch-all term increasingly used to describe policies that benefit anyone who is not white and male. Is that what DEI is? So as Ellie and I were thinking about this, and we were really thinking maybe there's an overrepresentation. Again, this is a similar idea that we were thinking about back in 2022 of these representation metrics, where the fight over DEI has been mistakenly centered on this, whereas it was only meant to verify outcomes of organizational process that rectified historical and ongoing discrimination. And we see DEI as fundamentally about basic human rights, it's fairness, it's equity, and yes, it's also merit. So it's all those things. If we look at our data, we see that actually the total number of representation metrics has actually increased in our data set from 2022, as I said, to 2025 by close to 10%. And just put down below an example of what we would call a representation metric. What is the proportion of women in managerial positions? What is the number of women in managerial positions? So this Ellie and I thought a lot about it, and we said we need to figure out what our criteria are for metric selection. And this is our criteria, which we're keen to get your feedback on. First, we wanted to leverage the existing metrics, but especially those that are kind of the leading metrics that companies are using, and that is particularly the European Sustainability Reporting Standards and the Global Reporting Initiative are even though the ESRS standards are being rolled back, we took a good look at those that the principles for responsible investment are supporting stay within the current standards. We want to prioritize metrics that capture non-discrimination and are characterized by having clear, transparent systems and processes, and are actively working on mitigating conscious and unconscious bias via training, so bringing around that sort of cultural internal shift. But we want to kind of deprioritize representation targets for a variety of reasons, partly the U.S. current environment. There was always some difficulty, it's very context specific, so always some difficulty looking at some of these issues in Europe where it could be impermissible to report on certain demographics. Often representation is used as a proxy for culture, but the link between the two isn't always straightforward. And they often fail to capture where the power lies. So just like that GRI metric that I showed in a previous slide, it says, well, are they in managerial positions? And a question, and this is something that Ellie brought up in our earlier, when we were talking about the earlier report, about oftentimes women are not occupying the leadership roles that handle, that they may be doing PR, the head of PR, the head of human resources, but they're not the head of finances and so forth. So they don't really have the power within the company. So we have to be careful about that. And again, disadvantaged groups can be very context specific. So how do we know what the right percentage of X population should be within a company? And so this is kind of an example of an ESRS disclosure metric from the European Sustainability Reporting Standards that is a pretty good metric around anti-discrimination policy, but it has this piece in Part C around positive action that we need that needs to be taken for certain groups that are a particular risk of vulnerability on its own in the workforce. And that raises sort of questions for us about, is that where we should be focusing on in terms of metrics, or are we going to gain more ground by sort of putting those sorts of questions to the side and focusing more on the on ensuring an equitable workplace. And I just realized that on the previous slide, I did not mention, and I think this is important, the importance of tracking demographics. So we're not saying we don't track demographics. We absolutely do need to see how organizations are doing so that they can detect their own bias. So I want to be clear about that. So I just want to go through very quickly because I know we don't have time for this. This is very much our work in progress. We have 5 kind of categories. Governance and accountability being one, with an anti-discrimination policy and board oversight. And we've gone through all of these 700 some metrics and selected those that refer to or about these topics. And you'll see in the far right column, that is the number of metrics or the number of frameworks that have a metric of this type, so that these are not lone metrics, and we're going to be contextualizing them and talking about how even these topics are treated across the frameworks. The next category is hiring, promotion, and dismissal. This follows again this Title VII, which has a focus on hiring, promotion, and dismissal. And you can see there on the left, we have looked at both the job announcement and the job description and the hiring process and screening. And within that, there are sometimes some subtopics like how AI enables resume screening and how to sort of screen out for bias, and also recruiter training. I would point out, I know I'm not going through the metrics because we don't have enough time, but just that you'll see CREA. This is the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance that PolicyLink out in has been working on, and they are, we think, absolutely excellent. These are not metrics per se, these are standards and guidance, but they have some wonderful things in there, and we've really benefited and learned quite a bit from that. And so we'd like to lift those up. And you'll see them mentioned a lot in here, as much as we really want to lean in on, as I said, those standards that are used more.
Joanne, sorry to interrupt you. You run out of time.
Okay.
So you want to finish in 20 seconds, 30 seconds?
I can finish. I'll just finish. So here are the next categories: equitable and inclusive workplace, performance and employee feedback. So getting that feedback. And then these are 3 metrics that are inequality related that we're still considering around career development, living wage, and CEO worker pay. And this is my final slide because these are really our kind of questions for you all. Did we get our criteria for metric selection right? Our approach emphasizes equitable and transparent policies and processes for hiring, promotion, termination, wages, and benefits for all employees. But is there, in fact, a case to be made that we make reasonable accommodations for improving the recruitment and retention of the historically marginalized? We've opted to narrow the scope to workplace metrics, trying to capture both employees and contingent workers, but is there a case to be made for broadening the scope? So to use that inequality, those inequality metrics, should they be in or out? And then in our choice of frameworks, we, as I mentioned several times, we continue to emphasize established frameworks as opposed to the less widely adopted frameworks. And is that the correct approach, or should we be using those that capture the important nuances and be lifting those up? So those are some of the things we're thinking about, and apologies for going over.
Thank you, Joanne. So there is a question from Pavel, who is a speaker for the next session. Among the metrics that you collected, what is the proportion of process metrics, i.e. measuring DEI activities? Arguable, DEI is more about activities than outcomes.
Do you want to take that, Ellie?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for Joanne for sort of sprinting over this. You did an amazing job. Thanks for the question. I think Joanne mentioned it earlier on. We tried to steer away from representation metrics. So I would say that probably a lot of the indicators and the metrics that we propose are focusing more on processes to try to de-bias some of these processes. To your point, Alessandro, about power and about certain groups being privileged, if the process is fair, transparent, open, and is based on a human rights approach, then it can sort of take that bias away. However, we do put emphasis on tracking data and the demographics in order to understand whether these processes actually work or not. But we did steer away from representation metrics, also following from what Joanne mentioned, the previous work that had been done on DEI back in 2022, and because the representation at the moment, as you know, affirmative action is a no-go place in the US jurisdiction. I don't know if I missed anything, Joanne.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Erika, now the floor is yours, Erika George.
All right, thank you very much. I had a question for Joanne, but I'll ask them offline. All right, and let me share my screen. Well, okay, is that working?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks especially to Matteo and Marcella for organizing, and to the fellow panelists for exchanging and sharing ideas. I'm going to speak from the vantage point of a legal academic and what it's been like in my role as Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Engagement to help first-year law students navigate law school and also look towards roles in the profession when the profession is arguably under attack in the United States for reasons of advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion and taking positions that this administration perceives as adverse to it. So I'll speak in three parts. I'll first outline the context and challenges. We've talked about political pressure to dismantle DEI, but I think it's important to appreciate that we're in a context of, in the United States, mass deportations, political violence, and assaults on communities of color more generally. I'll then turn to the specifics of the costs and consequences of the law firms that reacted to the administration's attacks on their traditional business models and their ways of doing business in ways that advance inclusion. And then I'm going to talk about returning to our first commitments as attorneys, again, as a specialized profession, how I'm navigating that educational process for my students and what they're learning from the curriculum they're seeing in the broader world outside of our classroom, and the law profession's reactions to the challenges. So in the United States, we are a country that is experiencing greater diversity at the same time that there's a need for more equity and inclusion efforts, because historically we've excluded people from fundamental important institutions in our country. At the same time, there's greater resistance to efforts to include, attacking longstanding civil rights laws that came out of the civil rights movement. At the same time that we need to transform our institutions, I'm actually thinking that this is an opportunity for us to think about ways to redo DEI, for lack of a better word. I appreciated Joanne's very true example that the scope and definition of what is done at DEI varies greatly across corporations and law firms. This, without context, may look like a rather depressing slide, but this is actually showing progress over the decade of diversifying the legal profession. We've seen greater numbers of women becoming attorneys. We've seen people of color increasing in number in the population of lawyers generally. But of the 1,500 Article III federal judges in the United States, they're still overwhelmingly male, 67%, and white, 74%. So if we look to who is situated where in the profession, the upper tiers of private practice and the federal bench continue to be predominantly male and white. And much of the more recent racial justice movement in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd did lead to shifts in DEI commitments, perhaps policies, because there was an opportunity outcry as more and more people were able to see the devastating impacts of discrimination in the United States. So in that moment, 5 years ago, we saw more and more companies saying that they were going to interrogate the ways in which they contributed to inequality. So Microsoft was reconsidering how they were using or allowing law enforcement to use facial recognition technology. Those kinds of efforts and interrogations have been upended, but they were successful in some measure. There was an increase in the number of people who were people of color and gaining ground in corporate representation in leadership roles. So beyond branding and marketing, there was some movement. There was also a significant backlash. In highest and most salient example, the executive order of January 21st, within hours of being in office, taking a page from the playbook to Project 2025 and many pieces of litigation that had been brought over the years by conservative networks challenging efforts to end illegal discrimination, which is why this is a bit of a play on words. The executive order basically frames all of civil rights movements as reverse discrimination. So the purported purpose of this is to end illegal discrimination and advance merit-based opportunities. Alessandro pointed out how diversity and merit have been set against each other rather than seen as a totality and mutually reinforcing. But the executive order trades in a lot of, frankly, racist tropes by presuming that the presence of somebody who isn't male and white indicates illegal discrimination because you've got somebody who, quote unquote, did not earn it. So DEI is repurposed to mean the exclusion of people who have recently been included through DEI efforts or policies that are less discriminatory. In addition to the executive order, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission sent letters to 20 law firms demanding that they disclose their practices around hiring and promotion, very particular personal details of only attorneys of color in those law firms. And then beyond the ban on illegal diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we don't have a definition of, most practices of most firms everywhere are going to be consistent with existing anti-discrimination laws. But nonetheless, there's an overcorrection and an effort to extend this particular vision of what anti-discrimination is to embassies and through that corporations around the world. So this is taking a particular vision of what discrimination is and what merit is and demanding that all comply with it. And this was problematic. Immediately, the American Bar Association raised the alarm and intended to raise awareness and was concerned about the wholesale dismantling of departments in the federal government, the removal of professional people, and the ascendance of a unitary approach to an executive demanding compliance with a particular viewpoint. This is in contrast to our constitutional principles. We also saw that this met campaign promises that the president made to undo diversity initiatives. DEI, because it means everything and nothing in the public parlance, has come to be attached to discrimination against white people or promoting those who are undeserving. There was significant, oh gosh, I'm trying to find the exact numbers of what people mean when they say things. There's agreement on fairness, actually. There's disagreement on how diversity initiatives are done. So because the administration can capitalize on the lack of clarity and misunderstanding, they've been able to force a readjustment that is a retreat from programs that worked. So where there's agreement according to a study from NYU's Meltzer Center, is 99% of respondents across job levels agree that all workers should feel respected and welcomed at work, regardless of their background and identity. 99% of people would agree with it's important that my organization supports fair treatment of its workers, including equitable pay. So while there is division around what diversity is, there's agreement around fairness. This is a survey of my students in the aftermath of the election, asking them what they thought it may mean for their future prospects. As you can see, a lot of them were deeply distressed, some actually excited about the direction things may go. And it came down to, I think, where people perceived their benefits and burdens would adjust. Law firms had to face this. In addition to the EEOC letter, there were directed, targeted executive orders for particular law firms that had taken positions adverse to President Trump. So Paul Weiss, Willeke Farr, Jenner & Block, Perkins Coie. Some of those firms decided to agree to negotiate with the administration, and in exchange for having those orders withdrawn, agreed to comply and end diversity, equity, and inclusion, and further than that, to affirmatively donate millions of dollars of pro bono attorney hour time to causes that were close to the agenda of the White House. There were some firms that decided to challenge it, the first being Perkins Coie, and their arguments were essentially that this was interference with their independence to choose their clients and to choose the way to practice law. So while it sounded in DEI and equity, it was really about expression and independence. And in challenging these orders, Perkins Coie, Jenner & Block, and two other firms went to court. So far, there's a 100% winning streak in standing up for and fighting for the right to represent clients that you choose to represent and to compile your law firm consistent with federal anti-discrimination laws in ways that advance diversity. In the complaint against Perkins Coie, the administration points to their summer programs to increase diversity, their efforts to recruit diverse attorneys, all of the things that were good practice and effective ways to increase representation. And I do think that representation continues to be important because it can be a proxy for how effective and inclusive your policies and procedures and practices around hiring and promotion are. But the court, through Judge Burl in the DC federal court, emphasized the role of lawyers in society in making her ruling. She starts with citing Shakespeare's "First we kill all the lawyers," and then speaks about what the role of a lawyer in society is and the importance of protecting law firms and lawyers as being guardians of the rule of law. And if we fail to do that, we remove an impediment to a path to power that can become abusive and targeting. So while we're talking about ending DEI, I think really the conversation we're not having is the entrenchment of a particularly virulent form of white supremacy that demands obedience, compliance, and would cut out other ways of having conversations and even dissent. So the judge views Perkins Coie as having a viewpoint that's dissenting, a viewpoint that's diverse, and through First Amendment, at least in the United States, that kind of activity is protected, and they prevail. For the firms that did not go forward with challenging, there are risks of retreat. There's evidence that most employees still across demographics do value DEI programs when they understand what they are. So for example, employee resource groups, first generation groups, Asian groups, LGBTQ groups, 93% of those surveyed in corporate America believe those are effective and aren't problematic. And under anti-discrimination law, they wouldn't be, though firms that are over-complying are ending these kinds of resources. 92% that think that in more inclusive work environments like nursing rooms, childcare facilities, accessibility for disabled workers should be something that organizations are pursuing. Programs intended to increase representation, such as internships and mentorship programs and leadership training, also widespread support. Intentional college outreach, university outreach to diversify candidate pools, also support. Trainings on allyship and inclusion, 88%. The support starts to fall off on some of these other things, but there is cultural support for popular DEI initiatives when they are not termed as such, but they're doing the work of inclusion. So coupled with the court victories, the cultural imperative, but still working against an administration that is determined to end diversity, the challenges remain. So to the question that's been posed, what to do, I think there are lessons to be learned in the professional commitments that all attorneys have. When you become an attorney, the job you sign up for is being a professional that's responsible for upholding the rule of law. So these are the core values of the profession as stated by the American Bar Association. The most recent litigation was filed on June 16th. The ABA has now sued the Trump administration for its attacks on the independent legal profession. But the rule of law is our primary commitment. Also in the United States, diversity and inclusion, again, all people should feel safe and participate in society freely. Equity, justice, and access to the court system. So our model rules of conduct, there are three things a lawyer in the United States is. You represent clients, you're an officer of the court, so you stand for its legitimacy, and you're a public citizen with a special responsibility for the quality of justice, which makes it incumbent upon firms to challenge acts that impede that. So as a public citizen, improvement of the legal system, access to justice, and the administration quality of justice are imperative. And we don't have a quality system if we don't have all capable, competent, qualified people able to be of service, and the role of preservation of society. So the ABA also sets standards for law schools. I am in a law school, all law schools, and these are likely going to be challenged. This was a standard that was put in place again in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, but being more deliberate about the kind of education that we are providing to our students and ensuring that professional identity formation is a part of that. That requires a conversation about our similarities, our differences, our identities, and how the world treats us because of them. I see Matteo looking at me, so I'll go very quickly. The International Bar Association also has professional standards of conduct, and central to those are independence. This is consistent with a First Amendment approach and the obligations that we have. We also advise clients as lawyers, so a vision of how we should be advising our corporate clients that are confronting these challenges if they're in multinationals. We know we have UN principles on business and human rights that extend the responsibility to respect to businesses. We also know that there's a diversity of approach across jurisdictions to diversity. So in Europe, in the UK, pay equity, disclosures are necessary, but some of the rollback of the United States has meant that without it being required, corporations are removing that kinds of information from their website. So they're not doing the work of being able to know and show and demonstrate what they're doing to combat inequity, mostly because of fear. So as I'm working with my students, I'm inviting them to be self-directed and think beyond compliance, to think about their professional identity formation, where they want to show up and who they want to be, and how we create competent classroom cultures. I have some quotes from some students who are largely going to big law in the firm, I'm not in a law firm. I was in a law firm in a prior life, but in the law school that I'm in, and the students are calling on their law professors and law schools to do more. As one law student put it, law schools need to play a role in pushing back against the capitulation in big law and the DEI rollbacks. The public statements and other actions condemning these administrations could be good, but the firms that capitulated shouldn't be allowed on our campus. This is how far one student would go. Another student would be concerned about barring commitments to DEI because what does that mean for us? What are they doing to contribute to making the world more difficult for people who are different? So there are high expectations in this next generation, and I think they're ones that we can meet if we simply return to the first principles of what it is. I guess it's not simple, but the challenge of maintaining our commitment to our profession and the obligations we hold. So I guess this will continue to go through the court systems, but short of that, I think business has a powerful role to play in this cultural conversation.
Thank you, Erika. That was really amazing. I'm sorry to be, I'm not very good at keeping time, I must be frank, because all this is so interesting, and above all, is the first time that we have so many specific analysis. So it's really a pity for me to stop, to tell you to stop. So I'm glad to give you the necessary minutes. To the next speaker, please be moderate. I'm very sorry to be this bad cop. I think it was great. Thank you, Erika. Just one small remark. It's about a comment. It's about this independence value, because this is what is happening also with the attacks on the universities, especially on the DEI part. That before, this idea of reverse discrimination was in the Supreme Court, if I'm not wrong, the Supreme Court has always said that affirmative action is a legal problem compared to the non-discrimination principle, but universities can, to some point, recognize the importance of education and learning, and to have a diverse community within the university. It was part of a conversation on universities' autonomy and independence. Now, because now the attack is an attack on their independence, I think the DEI is just a proxy for the administration to target university and make them servants of the power and then to really to destroy their independence. So I like very much your emphasis on lawyers' independence and the independence of the legal profession. And I think we should reflect more on this intimidation and fear component in corporate decision-making in general, but also in the law firms' behavior that are now obliged to give up a lot of free hours of pro bono work to serve the people in power, which is the inconceivable thing in the past. So I don't know, Erika, if you want to react on that, like very, very few seconds, please.
Sure. Yes. I actually was surprised when I read the court judgments. They register more about independence and association and freedom than they do in equity. But equity is being treated as, if you believe in equity and you're being told to say that you don't anymore, or you have to silence yourself, that has become an expressive affinity, assembly issue for the federal courts. So that might be a way that they've moved around, but I think I didn't mention the Harvard litigation that's still in process, but much of this is sounding in a register of independence and choice and freedom. So it's interesting that the quote unquote right is moving towards this is discrimination, this is inequity, and the quote unquote left is moving towards, well, this is a matter of freedom and choice. And these are the choices we're making. So that is something that I didn't expect to see, that I think will be interesting to continue to follow. And it kind of tracks a free marketeering kind of approach in a way.
Thank you so much, Erika. So now I give the floor to Felicia Henderson.
Thank you so much, Matteo. Thank you, Marcel. I just want to do some housekeeping. I want to make sure that I understand how much time that I have, given the people who are coming after me. So can you just give me a little bit of a guideline? Do I need to be shorter than I intended to be, than the 12?
So we said 10 to 12 minutes. So now, I gave, more 12 minutes to everyone. So I will say 12 minutes. That would be great.
Okay. So I am going to essentially do what I intended to do, and do please buzz me if I go longer than my intention. I am Felicia Henderson. I am currently a lecturer at INSEAD Business School, where I co-direct the Advancing Diversity and Inclusion online program. The work that I'm going to discuss actually arises from my private work as an advisor to global companies, and it's a framework, or it's some thinking and a framework that developed over the last several years, and which has become, I think, increasingly relevant in the current context. So I got on a call with some DEI professors. So it's an academic DEI group from some of the top business schools in the U.S. And the U.K. and INSEAD. Just after the January 21st executive order. And my first reaction was, this is an opportunity. Everyone else was devastated. I would not say optimistic, but I was at least hopeful and somewhat lucid. And I don't think of myself as having a different constitution than the others. The fact is that I have been practicing in the context of significant headwinds as someone who sits in Paris and has been doing DEI and anti-racism work in Paris and throughout Europe for the last several years. So I, using the title, Can DEI Emerge from the American Shadow? And I should clarify that when I talk about the American shadow, I am giving it two meanings. The first is simply, if we think about foreign policy, the U.S. casting a long shadow and having this influence. And there is a reality, but also some perhaps outsized perceptions that the U.S. exercises extraordinary leadership in terms of research, design, implementation, and imposing, mandating DEI practices, particularly in multinational corporations, particularly in the business context. The second meaning for shadow, I don't want to go too much into my background, given the amount of time that I have. I am a former lawyer, Erika, but I am now someone who received a degree in master in change management from INSEAD, which focuses very much on psychodynamics of change. And so I connect some of the challenges with practicing DEI outside the U.S. with this idea of the Jungian shadow. And that is that in many contexts, when you approach someone to talk about DEI, there is actually this unconscious rejection of the inequalities that exist in their own society by creating this contrast with the U.S., by looking at the U.S. and saying, you know, all of the bad things, all of the inequalities in the world exist in the U.S. context, but they don't necessarily affect us. So I will go through this very quickly. I started to think about the question, what is happening? Where is this resistance coming from? When in 2020, beginning after the murder of George Floyd, I had a number of clients approach me asking that that I help them broaden their DEI strategies, which up to that point had largely focused on gender, to some extent, national culture, but they wanted to begin to think about a multidimensional approach to DEI, and in many cases to include some aspect of racial equity, including anti-Black racism, given the 2020 context. In working with these clients who had sought me out, knowing my nationality, knowing knowing the focus that they wanted, I would frequently hear, we are not the United States, as a form of resistance to express their objections to shaping a DEI strategy that focused on multiple dimensions, one of which would be race. So I began thinking, what does that mean? On n'est pas les États-Unis, as they say in French, we are not the United States. What does this reflexive refrain actually mean? What are people trying to convey? I also wanted to understand in what context I'm hearing it most frequently, what might be individual drivers, what might be cultural drivers. So in some countries, some corporate context, it would be more common than in others. And then as a practitioner, someone who actually wants companies to, and I'm not saying everyone on this call doesn't, but part of my daily work is actually trying to make impact. That's how clients measure my success. What strategies can I enact to reduce this resistance to DEI based on this perceived U.S. contrast? So I will go through this slide very quickly. I'm not going to point out everything. I will be happy to share these slides with Matteo and Marcel, but you can also pause the recording to spend a little bit more time here. What I do want to point out is that these are not my own personal observations. I did have conversations, both formal and informal, with dozens of people who are both American and non-American working on DEI outside the US. And I had access to a wonderful external data set from the DEI committee of a professional association representing internal professionals across Europe. And this refrain and these themes that I'm going to speak about were recurring. So what was I observing? Well, the first theme, again, if we think about individual psychology, there is this tendency towards reactance. You tell someone to do something, they don't want to do it. And so we have this psychological pushback to restrictions on choice. And when I was, when a person was perceiving DEI as something that was mandated by a US or by an Americanized actor, then they perceived that as a restriction on local autonomy. And so the resistance to DEI, to US driven or to US mandated DEI, was a desire to restore self-direction. That did not mean that they necessarily opposed the principles or the underlying objectives of DEI. They simply wanted it to come from a local source or to be shaped and designed in a local or culturally specific way. The second theme, closely related but different, is identity threat. And here, identity threat, you've perhaps heard of identity threat in the context of marginalized populations. Stereotype threat is a form of identity threat, the fear of confirming negative stereotypes or negative views about one's group. There is a body of work in identity threat that focuses on majority group stereotype threat, and this is the fear of being associated or having one's group associated with negative qualities. So, for example, in the U.S., there are studies where it is observed that white people do not, or they want to distance themselves from white identity when white identity is associated with racism. And so this national identity threat, as I have conceived it, there is this view that the U.S. comes in, or the U.S. actors come in and say, we have superior morals. We are approaching equality. We are mandating equality. We believe in a fair society, and this is the way that you can achieve it. And that perception of U.S. moral superiority, whether real or imagined, creates a threat to national honor. So people hear this as you saying, we are a less fair society. And so resistance in those cases is a desire to restore self-definition. And this comes across in terms of, for example, a frequent conversation that I have in France, and those of you who live and practice in France will have heard this. We adhere to color blindness. We have only one identity, and that is the French identity. So it becomes a perceived clash of morals. Now, what are the factors that I theorize as underlying this? Some of these relate actually to individual level psychological factors that will create resistance to DEI efforts. So we know, for example, that lack of knowledge about specific history, so for example, lack of knowledge about Black history will correlate strongly with lack of support for diversity and racial equity practices in the U.S. Many people do not know the national histories of exclusion and marginalization. It is simply, it's not just the U.S. that's scrubbing textbooks. It's simply not something that is taught broadly. Another factor that I perceive as correlating with a higher frequency of this objection is the lack of awareness about the national status quo. People live in their bubbles. And again, we know this in the US. There's great work out of Berkeley showing that the more privileged someone is, the less empathy that they have. And so people simply don't know what's going on in their own society. A third factor, which I can't see from, let me just adjust the settings here, is misperceptions about the U.S. approach to equality and to DEI. There are people who, and I encounter this more frequently than I really should, and people who believe that the U.S. Corporations are just doing quotas and preferences to put Black people into higher positions. And so these misperceptions about U.S. DEI also create a clash with how people might want to do DEI in their local settings. And finally, there is, I believe, a strong connection between the strength of one's attachment to their national identity and their desire to resist so-called U.S.-style DEI. So let me accelerate because I do know that I am approaching the time limit, Matteo. This is a framework. I am going to just, again, allow you to pause when you rewatch the video to think about this. But what I've done is I've created this framework for inquiry, analysis, and action that allows people to, it seeks to challenge or to address each of the factors that are creating some resistance to DEI. And when I say DEI here, I mean simply to enacting DEI even in a culturally sensitive, localized way. So it involves learning history, observing the current society, connecting with local advocates. In most countries, there are people who are already knowledgeable and who are advocating for greater equality. And then there is analysis and bringing down the global goals or the global vision to a more local level. Now, what do I think is going to happen in the future with respect to these dynamics? I unfortunately think that reactance may increase. Again, this is if it is unmanaged, if we don't recognize these tendencies, then I do think that the tendency towards reluctance or resistance is likely to be enforced. People will say, look, I told you we didn't need to do this. The US has tried it and it's not working. And so I don't think that the sort of reverse psychology where the US is pulling back, so now we will move forward, is likely to happen because reactance tends to be a maladaptive reaction. And so I do unfortunately think that it could be accentuated. I do think that the self-protective beliefs are likely to be perceived as validated. Our society is morally superior to the US because look at the chaos that is going on over there. As Erika very eloquently put it, there is an embrace of a virulent form of white supremacy. And I think it is easy for other countries to say, we are in fact morally superior. What are our opportunities, though? Why was I optimistic to come back full circle? I am seeing signs that U.S. practitioners, many of whom have, in fact, somewhat dictated in the past, dictated practices, are in fact more open to being adaptable. They are also curious about how other cultures are approaching DEI. The question that I have always asked, but that I'm hearing my U.S. peers ask is, how do we do DEI across multiple jurisdictions when there is suddenly this clash between regulations, et cetera? it's not so sudden, the clash, but I am happy that the question is becoming a more prevalent question. I also think there is some evidence that maybe companies in the U.S. are not pulling back as much as we think they are, but there is at least a pullback from public discourse. And I do think that that creates space for us to have a conversation about potential local innovation, local practices. And finally, I do hope that more people are seeing that it is in fact urgent. It is urgent for us to anchor DEI in multiple, I call it multipolar anchoring. It can no longer be the U.S. driving, the U.S. pulling because of capital, because of U.S. headquarters. The DEI practices in corporations have to be anchored in local values globally. And so I apologize to Matteo. I did try and time myself, but I know that I went over just a bit. But that is where I will stop.
Thank you very much, Felicia. I was glad to let you finish because it was very interesting. We have been discussing with Marcel a lot about this perspective, US versus others. I think for we European, it's very important how we frame the conversation from this policy shift. And so that was great to have your contribution on that. So I don't think there are questions unless the panelists want to comment on that very quickly. Otherwise, yes, Erika.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciated this, the social psychological literature, the psychology of it. When you spoke about stereotype threat, I believe there was also a literature kind of on grievance and replacement, right? So some of the racial anxiety that's going on in the U.S. may be attached to that. I just wanted to invite you to comment on that. I wasn't as aware of, I mean, I knew there were reactions to American exceptionalism, so it was helpful to see the social psychology around that. Have you also looked at internally what might be driving things in the U.S. to make this?
Yeah, so I do not work in the U.S. I do most of my work with multinational companies. I have experienced in executive education sessions, some U.S. participants who do raise the replacement, the grievance, I think it was Joanne who said DEI is any policy that relates to replacing white men. That's not, those are not her words, but that's how I read it. So when I encounter that, and this is often in multinational groups. So it's employees from numerous nationalities within one company. I don't actually see a lot of, and I would have to think a little bit more deeply about it. I don't actually see a lot of joining of that opinion. Other than in societies where there is already a large racial minority. So I see it, for example, in UK participants, US, and in Brazil. Other places, I don't know if we've reached the level, if we're talking about representation. I do think that there are perhaps perceptions that we're sort of reaching a potential tipping point, but I do think that there has been so little progress in power, access to power for particularly people of color in certain cultures, that fear is not yet as top of mind. But it's a great question, and thank you. And I will have to think about it more deeply.
Thank you, Felicia. Our next guest speaker is Dilara Inal. So Dilara, the floor is yours. We can see your screen, but we cannot hear you. Can you check your input, your audio input, please? Try to speak. No. Try without the earphones. No pressure. These things happen all the time, so no problem. Don't worry. Just do the necessary to make us hear you. No.
Maybe we go to...
Yeah, we can. So if you maybe you need to reboot your computer. Try to speak. No.
Still not work. Is it?
Yes.
Sorry, Zoom happens. Yeah, sorry. Hi
Problem.
everyone. It is Dilay now from Vienna University of Economics and Business. I work as a teaching and research associate at the tax law department. And in this presentation, I will explore the diversity, equity, inclusion with the concept of representation and taxation. Given the current political environment, particularly with the return of a Trump administration, the tax law agenda is focused on the future of international tax framework with the ongoing OECD-led efforts. Not showing anymore?
No, we don't see your slides.
Okay.
Thank you for
Yeah, thanks.
that.
I guess it should
Okay,
be
now
on
we
right
see
now.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, some technological problems occurred. With the OECD-led efforts and Trump administration's new stance on those efforts, the agenda is circling around what will happen now if we are gonna implement the new rules or not. And my research approach actually similar issue, but from a different angle. I've been particularly interested in questions of representation. And when I knew the new executive order, I thought, what does DEI mean in terms of representation of taxpayers? So I'm really glad to be part of this conversation today. And my agenda covers firstly explaining briefly the conceptions of political representation, formal representation, descriptive, substantive, and symbolic, and framing DEI in this sense. Then I will look how DEI look in taxation with the well-known principle, no taxation without representation. And I will conclude with some examples from tax law indicating there's a lack of a substantive representation. In her famous work, Hannah Pitkin identified four forms of political representation. First is the formalistic representation concerning authorization and accountability, the form of forming the representation, the procedures. Second one is descriptive representation. This stands for representatives resembling the people they represent in terms of demographic characteristics as gender, race, socioeconomic background. So it's about who are the representers. And the symbolic representation refers to this connection between represented and representative without a rational basis, actually. And the substantive representation means acting in the interests of represented, focusing on the representative's work, what are the outcomes, so what the representative does. And when we look into DEI as a matter of descriptive representation, or more, I would say, because it is surely about including diverse backgrounds and voices, but it's more than that. It's enabling those different backgrounds to actually affect the decision-making process and somehow change the matter. So my main concern is how we should understand the relationship between descriptive and substantive representation, because in her work, Pitkin is skeptical of descriptive representation, seeing it as merely symbolic, because choosing people from different backgrounds does not necessarily end up with a substantive representation. To some extent, this might be true. There's no automatic correlation, because it's not just choosing people from different backgrounds. Of course, there are other critics against descriptive representation, which was previously mentioned by Alessandro, whether we are choosing less qualified, less merit representatives, and it's also difficulty to implement these descriptive measures. But also empirical studies show that there's a really strong positive correlation between descriptive and substantive representation. Kornhauser's work shows that a female-controlled Congress would actually adopt different tax rules, different tax exemptions for childcare, domestic work, different expenditures. And Sewer's work also shows that female legislators are more likely to support regulations on women's health, education, children, family. Another work shows that when there are more younger representatives in legislative bodies, it increases the youth engagement with politics. So how it looks like in taxation, I understand is these two different dimensions. First, the tax legislator itself, who represents taxpayers and to what extent they reflect taxpayer demographics. And the second one is the rules themselves, rules for specific taxpayer categories based on gender, age, disability, different social statuses. There are many examples from different jurisdictions regarding this. They're not enough, but like lower tax rates for a certain age, or providing tax-exempted childcare services for female employees. But today's focus is about the tax legislator itself. So I will continue with the no taxation without representation principle, which relates to principle of legality, means tax laws are enacted, modified by the legitimate legislative body, but not just that, also the key elements of tax rules are designated by this body. The origins of this no taxation without representation principle or motto comes from US actually, because when British Parliament decided to tax American colonies, they objected to this because they didn't have any directly elected representatives in the British Parliament. And as a counter-argument, the British Parliament came up with this virtual representation doctrine, saying that whether you have an elected representative or not, British Parliament represents every and all subjects. Of course, it was not accepted, and so we have this modern sense of no taxation without representation in our hands. And this also provides the legitimacy for tax rules. So tax is legitimate only when it is socially accepted, and if it's arising from a genuine argumentative interaction among the representatives. I understand this is how representative presents on top of who they are and what are the outcomes. And Sean introduces this principle of congruence, meaning who decides for the tax rules should be the same people who pay for the tax and who are benefiting from the tax revenue. And if we can achieve this alignment of the groups in the tax decision process, then legislature will presumably make better decisions for tax rules. And at a national level, this seems working because after a certain age, every citizen has a right to vote. then that should mean that we are reaching this type of alignment, but this does not necessarily mean we are achieving substantive representation, because in many jurisdictions, who decides on tax policies and rules belong to social and economic elites rather than all groups of taxpayers. So based on the forms of political representation and the legal definitions of a legitimate taxation, I understand this as substantive representation of taxpayer, of those who pay taxes and those who benefit from public revenue are engaged in a genuine argumentative interaction where the representative is authorized and accountable. So this is long. So who are representatives, what they do, and how they do it in a nutshell. And now I would like to give some examples of lack of substantive representation in tax law, some historical and current examples. Historical examples being window tax in Great Britain, which caused lower income people to shut down their windows in order to not face this economic burden, which ended up with a general health problem in the society, which was ignored by the tax legislators. Another example is the newspaper stamp duty, which provided the elite legislator to control where information goes through newspapers. So they benefited from this tax, but this was in our current understanding undemocratic example. In contemporary examples, the international taxation framework in developing countries. This is a very hot topic, been discussed for many years, but it's increasing its importance. The OECD-led framework, which was widely used between countries to negotiate their bilateral tax treaties, is now criticized because it only protects the interests of developed high-income countries. And we need a more inclusive framework where we can change the already practiced double tax agreements. And as an alternative, UN is argued to be more inclusive. OECD did try, still has this inclusive framework where 140 countries are part of. But when we look into who drives the decisions, they are G20 countries, not the whole inclusive framework states. So this is one example. Another example, taxation of women in terms of these tampon taxes, just one example we can give. It's an umbrella term for taxation of any menstrual products. And some countries are abolishing them. Some countries apply some reduced rates. It's also a matter of representation. From my origin country, Turkey, in the parliament, 4 times it was proposed to abolish tampon tax. And all 4 proposals came from women parliament members. So it also shows how descriptive representation can actually facilitate substantive representation. Taxation of couples and families is also another discussion point, because some jurisdictions joint filing is mandatory, and then this puts women who are usually the second earner in those families been subjected to higher tax rate because of their husbands, because they're those kinds of heteronormative marriages. There's also another problem for taxation of families, that most tax rules are dependent on the civil law rules of those jurisdictions, which they're not necessarily accepting different household arrangements, or they do not provide equal marriage for all citizens. This also creates another layer of problem. So we need queer representation in how to tackle with family-related issues. Double tax treaties, which we mentioned for OECD versus UN discourse, are being negotiated by government officials, and government officials are not elected representatives, they're appointed representatives. So another discussion that if it is aligned with representation principle for tax matters, even though those signed agreements are, of course, passes through a parliamentary process depending on different jurisdiction, but this may be just a formality. And also another issue, taxation of non-citizens, given the fact that remote working is becoming one of the default way of working. We are more mobile, and on top of many conflicts around the world and climate change, people are immigrating to different countries, and those migrant workers do not have a right to vote in the country where they provide the value and pay their taxes. So these all issues can be put through a lens of representation. And my question is whether this right-hand side examples might, because of a formalistic deficit, maybe if we put a more different institutional framework, can we tackle and make it more substantively represented way of tax rulemaking? Whereas I argue the other side of examples signal that there's a descriptive and argumentative deficit, because who negotiates these terms, who argues in which platforms like OECD or not, in parliaments or not, might be coming from this descriptive and argumentative deficit. So these, for my examples, I'm so happy to discuss, or in case afterwards you would like to reach out, this is my contact.
Thank you, Dilara. It was really amazing. We were just jumping in to tell you that you were running out of time, but that was perfect. Any reaction, any comment? I think this is a very, I've seen some literature on this gender and taxation, especially in France. I think there are a couple of specialists that write on that, and it's a super interesting topic at the crossroads of two important disciplines. So let me check. Is there anything in the chat? No? Okay. So thank you so much. Dilara, I think there is a lot of, the fact that there are no comments doesn't mean that the topic was not interesting. I think also with these new intersections that we need some time to elaborate. And so I hope this generates new reflections, especially when this version will go online. But thank you so much. Now I will give the floor to Suad Luisi. Suad.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Matteo and Marcel for this opportunity to speak. I wasn't planning on showing any slides, but everybody else did, so I will too. I don't know if you can see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Yes, I wasn't going to share any slides because I really wanted this to be more of a discussion. I work at the Grenoble École de Management, so it's the business school in Grenoble, France, where my research... Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, where my research has been mostly about disability inclusion, mainly in higher education. I'm really interested in inclusive pedagogy. And I really wanted to be part of the discussion because I feel like oftentimes disability isn't considered in the DEI discussions, and I feel that it does need a seat at the table for a few reasons, and I'll show you as we go. I think that oftentimes it's not included because it's different than the other social categories. One of the main differences is that it doesn't discriminate. So people of all genders or ethnicity will and can be affected by disability. We will all at some point in our time have a disability. I mean, if I were to break my leg tomorrow, I will not be able to walk up the stairs for a certain number of months. And later on in life, I think that all of us will need support from our loved ones. And people with disabilities are among the most vulnerable. That's something that we need to keep in mind as well. And also, when people have that autonomy, it increases dignity and it prevents poverty, because poverty and disability are very related. I'll show you later on. And I think one of the major reasons why disability is different is because it's the only time where we're supposed to discriminate. At job interviews, for example, we are supposed to check and see if the person is able to do the job. Do they have the ability to do the job? Whereas we cannot discriminate by age, sex, religion, etc. We do discriminate by levels of ability. And I mean, we don't want to admit it, but obviously in some cases we have to. I mean, it would be hard to be a firefighter if you're in a wheelchair, right? Disability requires accommodation, whereas other social categories don't. I would love for us to live in a world where we do accommodate for other social categories. I'm originally from Canada, and I remember 25 years ago in Toronto, there were companies that were accommodating for religion. So if you were at a certain company Friday afternoon, you can come back from lunch later because, well, you have to attend the service for religious service for Muslims. There's often a prayer room in a lot of major places. I live in France now, so that's not the case in France. So if we talk about France or any regular place, we're not talking about Canada, which is very open in that extent. Other social categories don't require any kind of accommodation. So you're not going to accommodate for me because I'm a darker skin or because I'm a woman. But disability really depends on that. And since disability is not considered like the other social categories, people with disability continue to face the most discrimination. Disability can be anything that's visible or invisible. It could be a mental health condition. It can last 12 months longer. It could be, temporary as well. And after COVID, we've seen a rise in mental health issues, especially, but not entirely amongst young people. So it does affect a lot of people that we know. Long-term conditions can be anything like a learning difficulty. So we've seen growing numbers of students who are being detected for learning disabilities. The schools, I find, I come from Canada to France, so it's a very different system, but I find that it's hard for teachers to accommodate for learning disabilities. The majority of disabilities are invisible. Now, 80% of people with disabilities live in the developing world. Like I said, there's a very close connection between poverty and disability. Around the world, 1 in 7 people have a disability. And what is surprising concerning our topic today is that 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. So it's higher than the global average. And we're talking about a country that is, a global north. Shouldn't be the case, but it is. Depression is considered a disability. Obesity is considered also a disability. Again, not all disabilities can be seen, which is probably why we don't think about it all the time. In fact, 90% of people with disability, it doesn't show. It's hidden. Now, the cost of disability, there's a lot of different things that come into factor. Like we've got the direct costs, obviously, treatment, including travel and access to health care. The indirect costs are things like taking time off to go with your loved one to take them to their appointments, or taking care of someone, the lost income that you would have had from this incapacity of earning income. So these are some of the costs of disability. And in fact, in the United States, I'm really worried about, I'm not an expert on the US whatsoever, because my research really is about students in France. But when I think about how not only is there this rollback in DEI, but then there's also, the increasing costs of healthcare, and I don't know how this is going to be affecting people with disability, and I'm wondering, where this is going to go. But anyway, that's not part of my discussion today. Half of the people in this world who are disabled, who have a disability, cannot afford healthcare. The costs are pretty astounding. Just for example, the production of hearing aids only meets 10% of global needs. That was just an example. So again, disability and poverty are very closely related, because, when somebody has a disability, not only do they have limited access to education, inadequate health care, etc., fewer employment opportunities, but that also obviously leads to things like poor nutrition, or obviously low income. Now, again, I just want to compare the US, the situation with the US with the rest of the world, the rest of the places where people have less access to healthcare. I think the difference is really that in the US, it's a very individualistic kind of lifestyle, which is, common in the global North, whereas in some places, where the more poorest countries in the world, a lot of people are probably looking at disability kind of in a more old-fashioned kind of way. For example, the oldest, more traditional model is religious. So God wanted me to, lose my arm, and so be it. In the mid-1800s, the problem was put on the individual. So I have a medical issue. This is, my problem. I can't fit into society because I have this issue. Later on, with the disability movement in the 60s and 70s in the UK, disability started being looked at as an issue of impairment. So I have an impairment, and society was not built for me. It's built for someone who is, quote unquote, normal. So I cannot access buildings, for example, or I can't access certain things because of these barriers that were put into by society. So these cultures that kind of still look at the medical or social model, these are people who help each other. So these are families, people still live in close-knit communities, and they help each other out. Whereas in the US, people are more isolated, and this is probably why the rate of disability, like the 1 in 4 Americans, is probably a little bit higher, because it's got a bigger effect on day-to-day life. The biopsychosocial model is the one that is the basis of the World Health Organization, which kind of takes into consideration the medical model and the social model, where we do consider disability as a social category, but we do need accommodations in order to accommodate for the person's impairment, and that's how it is in most global North countries. And so when you look at disability and you say to yourself, okay, so it is different than the other social models, then there has to be a different approach. Earlier, I don't remember, I think it was Joanne who said all people should feel safe and participate in society, and it's like a basic human right. And in order for that to happen, we have to take a rights-based approach for sustainable development. We can't really rely on the business case with disability, because you can argue that people with a disability are not more productive, and in a lot of cases they might not be. But so these are the 5 basic principles that need to be taken into consideration. Number 1 is social protection. Are they housed correctly? Do they have the minimum healthcare and rehabilitation, access to devices? The second one is accessibility to education, to loans or information, to jobs. Consciousness as well. Are they even aware of their own needs? And this I see concerning people with neurodivergent tendencies, or they might not even want to look different. It's an invisible disability. I don't want the stigmatization that will go with disclosing my disability, so I will just suffer in silence and not ask for accommodations. Influence, this is equal opportunity to influence decision and policy making. They need a seat at the table. And then control, take initiatives to assert their influence and to promote awareness of their own rights. So we know that this does work, I mean, this approach of accommodations and including people with disability and giving them this autonomy, we know it works. I'm sorry, I don't have more recent statistics, but we know that from between 2013 and 2019, the disability employment gap was reduced quite a bit in the UK. We have also statistics that support people with disability. So for example, 84% of people questioned believe that disabled people do make a valuable contribution in the workplace, etc. I don't think we have a lot of time to go into all of that. So that was the example of the UK. In France, French law sets employment obligation quotas. So 6% of workers in any company of 250 employees or more. Okay, that's wrong. It should be 250 employees or more, must be declared disabilities. The current rate is 3.5%. But I mean, it's not perfect yet, but the law is there to encourage companies to go into that direction. And 19% of people with disabilities are unemployed compared to 9% for the entire working population. So the gap is closing in France as well. 95.3% of students with disability have accommodations in their universities. There are programs in place. Any company that does not meet the 6% quota has to pay taxes that goes towards things like buying computers or making students with disabilities lives easier, or people entering the workforce, they can get free education, etc. So the final thoughts, people with invisible disabilities, we don't talk about it a whole lot. They're not visible. We don't see it. They face additional challenges because there's a lack of support, lack of understanding. The occurrence of disability increases with age. This is particularly important. Globally, 1 in 7 working adults, which is what I said before, has a disability, but as we get older, that increases. So it's 1 in 2 people over 65 years old. And we know that in a lot of global north countries, there's an aging population. The US is not exempt from that. And the key areas of concern include financial support, adjustments in the workplace, or just lack of awareness and social understanding. And in the words of Stephen Hawking, we have a moral duty to remove the barriers to participation and to invest sufficient funding and expertise to unlock the vast potential of people with disabilities.
Thank you so much, Suad. It was a very, very nice presentation. Also, as you can see, we have covered quite an extensive number of topics. So I suggest we move because the time is really tight. If I suggest to move to our last but not least guest speaker, Gaofeng Meng. Gaofeng, you need me to share your slides or you can do it?
Yes, and let me say if I can find my slides. I think I sent you one by email. I'm not sure. It's say it's.
I can share if you want. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm not sure it's this one. Yeah.
Okay.
It should be this one. No.
Yes.
Yeah, it's this one.
I see that. Okay, please.
Okay. So thanks a lot, Matthew, and it's a privilege to run the paper here. And I'm a lecturer in law at the School of Law, SOAS University. At the same time, I'm a research fellow or research associate at the University of Cambridge. And I, my email address is here. And please email me if you want to contact with me. And today, I want to just talk about some institution diversity and also complexity of institution change. So I used some theoretical framework. Basically, it's Dolph et al. 2004 and published in the Journal of Evolution Economy. Use that the three levels and macro, meso, micro. Instead, that's the macro and the micro, that are two levels. So, and also state and parency, that kind of distinction. So here, under the complexity is relative. So in my opinion, if you use the three and rather than two, maybe that can, and much better scaffolding to understand the Chinese land system from the commune system to the household responsibility system. So basically, this is engaged with Douglas C. North and also Alina Ostrom's institutional economy and try to develop some kind of political economy and by modeling Chinese and institution change, especially because that's the institution change make a difference. Maybe that's the secret points for Chinese economic growth in the past 4 decades, and also it's a starting point for other, and reform. So here I used a rule change in one village level because at that time that's the lowest, and the collective organization. So basically, it's a village about 200 people, and how about this institution change and change the channel. So at that time, the commune system is built by Chen Mo from 1956 until his death, about 20 years. So under that system, there's 3 levels. The lowest level is production team, about 200 to 300 natural village, and then you have the production bracket, and then you have the commune. Commune is the highest, basically similar township, a town, about 30,000 people, or even 100,000 people there. But at the same time, it's also the lowest government. But before, beyond that, there's some local governments. So that we have the county, we have the prefecture, we have the provincial. So that's the political structure. Sorry, and too fast. So, and the commune system, the contract production with the team is required. And the contract production to groups is allowed, but contraction production to households or family is forbidden. But in the 1978, a village in Anhui province, about 20 peasant households, 18 is peasants, another is two cadres. But these two cadres also is that the peasants, because their identity, their interests is similar to other peasants. So basically easily for them to understand each other. So that's the village. Totally have the 191 people there. So they created a secret agreement. Please allow me to read it. We allocated the cleveland to each household, which each head of household signing and affixing their seal. If successful, each household committed to fulfilling its annual state procurement quota without seeking financial or green assistance from the state. In the event failure, we, the cadres, were prepared to face imprisonment or even execution. We request that the remaining members guarantee the upbringing of our children until we reach the age of 18. So basically, this is very bold and and institution change, but this is they keep the secret. And later, the commune leader knows this, and his sympathy the peasants, but he think they are too greedy, too far. So he didn't allow them to do. But at the same time, he reported to the county leader, and in order to avoid punishment in future. But the county leader, this guy is sympathy under the peasants and also give his blessing. Says, okay, under my jurisdiction, there's over 3,000, production team. If one go to the capitalist road, it doesn't matter. And he also reported to his supervisor. His supervisor also says, okay, let them do the experiment. If they successful, that's fine. If not, it's not the big issue. So he gave them for 3 years experiment. And later, the highest, the provincial leader, and visited it and very happy with their results because they solved the issue of the shortage of food and clothing and also fulfill the state procurement and also the collective reservation. So all the three parties, the state, the local governments, and the collective and also peasants, they all benefit from this institution change. So that's the meso level. Basically, it's the local government's level. And also, this guy and the provincial secretary, the number one, was promoted as a vice premier in central government with the pyramid leader Deng Xiaoping's support. And Deng Xiaoping supported this experiment. He's very different of Mao Zedong because in the 1961, he says, no matter what are the black cat or white cat, if you can catch the mouse, you are a good cat. So he says, okay, anything, and if it's good for the peasants, if it's illegal, we can legislate. So in another about 3 years, they used the policy, the number one central document, legislate it. And then later, and gradually, they written these rules created by peasants into the constitution, into the rural contract law, into the property law. So they institutionalized that. So that's the rules created at the macro level jumped into the micro level through the local governments and and become a national scale on the institution system. So my conclusion is this, and other people, like Professor Just Evelyn and at the Peking University always says, okay, this introduction of the household responsibility system is economic efficiency. But my argument is no. It's basically it's a political and social construction. It's include power and struggle, ideological issue. And why? And 10 years ago, there are similar, practice in Guizhou province, but it's the successful experience have to be kept underground until 10 years later. And when this kind of practice was legitimized, they told other people that we had done that more than 10 years ago. So I would say this is absolutely needs some, political, social, and that's the construction. And the second one, I would say we will embrace that kind of 3 levels and analysis framework rather than that's the 2 levels. For example, peasantry versus the state. It's peasants. It's portrait as a victims of the states or whatever. I say this kind of they always say this institution change is otherwise it's top down or or bottom up. I say no. It's about complex interaction between peasants, local governments, officials, and the central government. So my another conclusion is this, and that's also institution diversity. Why the communal system in its one quarters, lead to economic stagnation and decline. We also have the great famine. More than 30 million people has died. Most is the peasants. And also we have in the past more than 4 decades that the and the land system and led to spectacular economic growth. So basically Chinese people used 7% land and solved 25 people's food. So compared with the USA, EU, and other countries, it's more efficiency. So it's this institution change. So I should stop here. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gaofeng. It was great to explore these unexplored dimension of DEI. And is there any comment or question? Unfortunately, we don't have much time because we plan to finish at 7, but it's 7:07. So I mean, we are close. We are close. So we can take one question if there is. Otherwise, we will adjourn to the next week when we will have 7 more presenters. And I am very grateful to each of you for your participation. Erika, yes.
Oh, I was just going to ask a question about trajectory, whether you think this is moving in a constructive direction and what some of the obstacles would be and what needs to happen. I know that's a big question.
Thank you. Thanks. You mean the direction is positive or negative? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what do you anticipate is likely? I liked when you said, a black cat, a white cat. We're concerned, can the cat catch the mouse?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's
Thanks.
encapsulated kind of a functional.
I think several things. And one thing is that the local peasants' knowledge is very important because they are, dealing with how to growing food, whatever. So here, that's one, it's peasants or experts design some system for them. So in that sense, I aligned with Alina Ostrom,'s, and her findings. This is one. And the second one is that when you view a political system, and we take a complex attitude. It can be destructive, but it also can be harmony. For example, in China, and we haven't go to that, for example, from one extreme to another extreme. For example, if you compare with Russia, with other European countries, not go to the collectivization to privatization. Then this is some hybrid institution change. You can say sometimes maybe can also, adapt its own country's culture or history. I think that's the, a second point. And the third point, I think, and institution design is very important to solve poverty, and because if you give people and let them, connect with the means of production, for example, let them access land, also let them control their own labor, whatever, give them autonomy and, initiatives and allow the local experiments, that's maybe more productive. So basically, that's my three findings. I have this paper about 13K, and also I'm happy to share and give to one journal, the Journal of Institute in Economy. It's in a review process, but I'm happy to, to send that, Matthew, if, you can give to them. And thanks. Yeah, that's my answer. Thanks, your good question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Marcel, you want to say something?
A huge thank you for everyone today. As you can see, the discussion was really around reframing the conversation around DEI. And what we'd hoped to achieve was sort of give all these different lenses through the taxation, with Dilara, for example, to Gaofeng, which is sharing now, disability, all these different layers to show the complexity and how we reframe the conversation. And next week, we hope to sort of deep dive more into the redesign of the system. So on this, we want to thank our speakers, first of all, for taking the time and sharing your insights with us. Obviously, my partner in crime here, Matteo, present, and the EDI Forum through the different, it's a sort of a collection of business schools that have tried to bring light around diversity and share our different insights, really how we can work across business schools on this topic and really gather more insight to be able to move forward on the topic. So a huge thank you to everyone today, and we hope to see you all again next week for session 2.